Hello, and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down the finals match that took place at Queen's Court 2024 between Derek Ray and Chris Yang. It was a pretty interesting fight, but one thing I want to call attention to is the fact that this tournament had a 7 exchange limit, which means that there's not going to be very many exchanges to go over, but it does mean that the adaptations that we see both fencers use are all the more critical. Also, it is a weighted afterblow scoring, so you're going to see a couple of interactions where someone gets hit in the hand, someone gets hit in the head, and the person who hits the head gets 2 points. So it'll be interesting to see how these rules affect the fencing of each person and how that ultimately might determine the outcome. So for our first exchange, we have a pretty interesting one. At the beginning, both fencers sort of stay in their corners and try to size each other up a little bit, and the fencer on the left takes a notably defensive stance, namely that while fencer on the right is changing guards, probing in and out with their footwork, fencer on the left stays more or less stock still. And normally what this does is it indicates to your opponent that you're looking to get a parry. You're looking to wait for your opponent to make some kind of attack, which you'll hopefully move backwards from, forcing them to overcommit, and then get a nice parry riposte out of it. And that's obviously what fencer on the right was probably thinking up until the point where fencer on the left comes forward. They spring forward rather explosively and suddenly and throw what I can only call a kind of low right zwerg, a horizontal kind of cut to the hands. Now, in my opinion, this didn't really intend to land because what it did do was set him up for a position where immediately upon falling into the cross guard of his opponent and being unsuccessful in his Sverkow attack, he is able to pivot immediately into a hanging parry on his right side, which completely closes off that line and prevents him from getting hit in the parry riposte and the counterattack that his opponent throws. And this, in turn with his continued forward momentum, allows him to come all the way around from his hanging parry on his right side to throw a low cut on his left side and looks like make some decent contact on the hand. Though it is worth pointing out that at this point, both fencers have managed to move their way pretty much all the way out of the ring on the back side, and that the fencer on the right did a pretty good job of trying to parry that, although it sets up a situation where, given the fact that fencer on the left was coming forward so aggressively, fencer on the right really didn't have any room to successfully do anything, even if they had successfully parried that follow-up attack, because they would have been out of the ring and everything would have been over. And what this can help you understand is that if you're fencing or you're in a tournament, it's very, very beneficial to carry your forward momentum to the point where you push your opponent out of the ring. Not necessarily physically by, shoving them or grappling them, but by coming forward, you ensure that your opponent has to either stand their ground and get into a kind of grapple or back out of the ring and risk getting rid of any kind of counterattack they would be able to throw. It's a really good understanding of ringmanship, I guess as you would call it in boxing, and the distance and timing allows for such that you can almost use this kind of aggression as a form of safety to make sure that even if your opponent is able to back away and parry successfully, the attack that they're going to be able to throw is going to be a little bit off balance. It's not going to be very stable. And more importantly, they're going to be out of the ring and probably unlikely to score any points. So for the second exchange, we see an immediate adaptation from fencer on the right. They have seen in the previous exchange that fencer on the left is perfectly fine to sit still more or less in their corner and wait for them to play footwork games and change their guard around. And the adaptation is that fencer on the right is going to continue to do what they were doing before, but up the intensity. And what I mean is that instead of just moving in and out of range and maybe gesturing a little bit with your sword, they're moving closer and closer with each iteration of these feints. And what that does is it helps get you into range to land your single time aggressive action while your opponent stands stock still, waiting and afraid to bite on any feint that you're throwing for fear that they're going to have to overextend in order to reach you. It all pays off towards the end where fencer on the right manages to get close enough to throw an explosive feint on their left side, followed up with a cut from their right, which hits the hands of fencer on the left. At the exact same time, fencer on the left tries to throw a little bit of an untersverk from their hanging parry kind of position, but it doesn't really land very well, and in my opinion, it was much more of an intended parry that ended up biting on a feint that wasn't there than a really intentional strike, and it does land pretty flat. So I think fencer on the right definitely got the better of this exchange, and most importantly, it was because of the adaptation that they made from the information they gathered from the previous one. So for our third exchange, and remember there's only 7, We have two critical pieces of information that each fencer knows. They know that they have gotten points each when they came forward with good momentum and a feint, and two, that the feint was bitten on very hard by their opponent, primarily because of the explosive forward momentum. Now, what that means is that each fencer now has to realize that chances are the first explosive movement out of their opponent may be a feint, and two, that whoever does that explosive movement first is much more likely to get the exchange. And so what happens here is that now you see both fencers no longer having a very defensive posture, but are both trying to move in and out of each other's range to try to bait an attack. And in this particular case, we get the exact same thing from the first exchange. Fencer on the left comes forward with a big, large-looking attack from their upper left opening, which fencer on the right does not even immediately think is threatening. And the reason for that is they guessed that that attack that they're showing from their upper left opening was a feint, and it was. Instead of throwing to their upper left opening, fencer on the left immediately pivots to an undersverk on their right side, which fencer on the right tries to counter by throwing a horizontal cut across the line from their left to their right in order to meet that untersverk in a good position. And it does mostly work out for them. If you look at the footage, it's not exactly perfect, but from what I can tell, the undersverk still manages to make its way towards the body or lower arms of fencer on the right, while, of course, the middle strike from fencer on the right does manage to cut the line very well, taking out a whole lot of the momentum and landing up into the hands or upper shoulder area. After this exchange happens, fencer on the right does something very slick, which is they pull back their sword a bit and try to reassert their point in from an ox position directly into the chest of fencer on the left. And what this does is present a really strong structure from which to continue to back up so that when both of them reach the end of the ring, their follow-up attacks can't really land anything significant. So from my perspective, the ruling that this was a double could certainly have been possible, but it was a really intelligent adaptation from fencer on the right here that just maybe didn't quite pay off. So we're coming to the third exchange, and we saw some great adaptations so far. But now we get to the critical point where both fighters need to continue to adapt and hopefully predict the adaptations of their opponent in order to get ahead of the curve. And that's exactly what happens here. In the beginning of the exchange, both fencers are trying to stay a little bit defensive again and looking to probe an attack from their opponent, knowing, both of them, that chances are that first attack is going to be a feint. And we do see that happen. Fencer on the left comes forward with a gesture, a feint, which fencer on the right does in fact recognize as a feint. And they do this by throwing a cut to their opponent's hands. Now, one thing that's clear is that whenever you try to feint in HEMA, or really any kind of sword fighting, you have to raise your hands from a neutral position, and as such, they tend to move the crossguard, which is what's supposed to defend your hands, out of position. And that is exactly what happens here. Fencer on the left goes to gesture their feint, and in so doing, they raise their tip, and they raise their hands, and they raise their crossguard so much that it exposes the middle and bottom of their hands to attack. Recognizing this feint, yet again, fencer on the right immediately throws a hand shot and attempts to back out of the action as a way of getting a free cheeky point. And most of the time this would work because the ability for someone to feint and then go into a follow-up attack is usually mitigated by the fact that they got hit on the hands, and then usually they're not aware of the distance they're going to be at, which means that someone who is hitting on the hands and then moving backwards out of the action can get well enough away that they won't get hit back. However, that is not what happens here. Fencer on the left, either because they had counter-adapted or had predicted it, knows that when they go for this feint, they are likely to get hit on the hands, and takes advantage of the afterblow rule set that they're currently fencing under to simply continue their attack, move forward with a bigger and more dramatic feint, take a really big step with their back leg, and throw a counterattack to the head. Now, in a right-of-way rule set, you might have to argue whether or not who attacked first or whatever, but in an afterblow rule set, all that really matters are the priorities and the point values of the targets that you hit, and whether or not it's fast enough. And in this instance, fencer on the left is able to deliver a cut to the head, which is worth 2 points, which means fencer on the right only gets 1 point for their hand shot, and they are unable to get out of the exchange, which means fencer on the left gets a full point, whereas fencer on the right put all that risk into getting a 1 point shot, only to get beaten out by the headshot. This is a really good example of counter-adapting because not only did fencer on the left know, or at least seem like they knew, that the fencer on the right was going to try to take advantage of their feints, but they used the afterblow rule set and a basic fencing mechanic to make sure that they could get their points regardless of what their opponent hit with them with on the way in. So for the next exchange, both fencers have had some adaptations. They both tried to change up their game, and they've both gotten some points. And what happens now at a certain point is that there's a little bit of a reset. Both fencers have now kind of exhausted the limits of what they would consider a reasonable amount of adaptation, and so it's often very common for fencers and fighters overall to kind of go back to square one and go back to what they're good at, because at this point, any more adaptations and counter adaptations might simply be beaten by the first and most obvious attack, and that's sort of what we see here. We see both fencers spend a pretty long amount of time sizing each other up again, almost as though it was the first exchange, and playing the similar sort of games that we saw in that first exchange. Fencer on the left staying very still and in their corner, fencer on the right being a lot more tentative about moving in and out of range and overcommitting to anything. And then at a certain point, we see a reversal of the first exchange where it is now fencer on the right's turn to come forward with a big explosive attack. Now, fencer on the left does a pretty smart move here, which is that knowing that the fencer on the right has explosively lunged at them, they can pretty much put up their hang and parry on their right side and normally be able to defend anything on that angle without really having to worry about whether or not they've feinted or pivoted to a different angle. As long as it comes on their right side, that hanging parry should be able to take care of it. And what we see here is a very interesting interaction where, due to the attack that fencer on the right throws, they actually manage to get underneath of the hanging parry, which is one of the weaknesses of a hanging parry, is that it takes a long time to get into position, and throw a very clean, undefended spheric strike straight to the head of their opponent. Now, after this happens, there's a little bit of a grapple, a little bit of a closing action, where both fencers are trying to pivot their way out of walking out of the edge of the ring. So there's some counter spherics that come out there, but from what I can tell, that first initial action managed to get underneath the parry, which means it landed clean with absolutely no parry or no block, and was a very, very nice execution of what I would call going back to basics. Again, that idea being that sometimes when you've adapted to somebody so many times, you have to go back to square one. Otherwise, you're going to end up looping yourself into doing some crazy stuff that you wouldn't normally do. For the next exchange, we see a continuation of the square one kind of fighting. We see fencers both on the left and the right being a little bit more tentative, feeling each other out once again. And this time we see a very interesting execution of a technique from fencer on the left. They do what I think is referred to oftentimes as a stepping parry, which is basically a morph of a feinted attack and a heavy defense. And what you do is you take a big step forward and then you throw up a hanging parry or just a big parry on whatever side you assume your opponent is going to attack you on. And it can be very, very successful, especially against people who, as we've seen up till now, have no problem explosively jumping forward and landing big attacks. This is a great way to make sure that not only are you having the forward momentum, which has shown to be very beneficial in this match so far, but also that you're taking care of any feints that are going to re-up on the exact same side, and any really big attacks where someone also might be coming forward explosively at you. Hanging parry, especially on your right side, has some very nice grapples that come from it. So you're kind of covered from most angles, most except your left. And in this case, we see a little bit of a good adaptation from fencer on the right again, where when fencer on the left comes forward with the stepping parry, which, to be fair, is not something that they've done before, fencer on the right recognizes it as a feint and attacks it in a similar way to how they did in the third exchange, namely that they try to snipe the hands of fencer on the left and then back out of range. And what happens here is, as far as I can tell, fencer on the right definitely lands their hand shot. And then afterwards, fencer on the right tries to pivot their hanging parry into a kind of low spheric that also hits the hands. It's a little unclear how each happens in a kind of tempo or an understanding of afterblows, but from my understanding, after this point, both proceed to try to counterattack one another repeatedly, and both of those counterattacks end up landing. After fencer on the left's kind of low spheric, they come back around to the other side on their high left opening, and do appear to get a very successful headshot out of that at the exact same time that fencer on the right, who has just landed a successful hand shot on their right side, simply kind of pulls back and throws another one. So as far as I can tell, there's 2 hand shots from the right and 1 to 2 good shots from the left. So I don't think it was necessarily wrong to call this a double or just a messy exchange that doesn't have a good conclusion. But what we're going to see coming up now is that this kind of messiness is going to continue, not because people are getting worse at their fencing, but because both people are trying to make sure that they're coming up with the right adaptation. And because they're both coming up with different things, some wacky stuff is going to start happening. For the next exchange, we see yet another adaptation from Fencer on the left, though it's a similar adaptation to what we saw earlier. As I mentioned before, there is a concept where you feint an attack with the intention, or at least the expectation, that you might get hit in the hands, and then you use that feint as a kind of delaying tactic to then come forward and throw a big attack from another angle that is hopefully going to land to a deeper target. And in an afterblow rule set, that can get you a 1-point differential, which can be very critical. Now, something we've seen in previous exchanges is that Fencer on the left, when they did their stepping parry, seems to favor a right side hanging parry. And this has benefited them a few times, but it has also become clear that it's not protecting them as much as they would like to. However, what we see is that Fencer on the left has managed to blend these two concepts together, and it comes to a very, very effective kind of feedback loop that a lot of people would really benefit from, and that is that hanging parries are very slow. They are often very well protected, but because they're slow, they often don't make it to their position in time to properly protect you. But what they are good at is setting up a counterattack in an afterblow rule set. And what we see here is Fencer on the left go into their hanging parry. They see that attack coming towards their hands, and they know there's nothing they can do to stop it, so they simply allow it to happen. They get hit on the hands, and they immediately come forward with that big Molinet and that big attack on their left side. Now, because Fencer on the right has thrown a hand shot on their left side, they are now trying to back out of the action as fast as they can. And what often happens is after people land their attack and start backing up, they put themselves in a position where they can't adequately protect the side opposite the one they've just attacked. Which means that after Fencer on the left has just been hit in the right side of their hand, they are free to attack the left side on their own body and attack their opponent's right side, which will now be difficult to protect when their hands are kind of stuck in their lower left area and they're trying to backpedal as fast as they can. This results in yet another exchange where Fencer on the left was able to get a point out of the afterblow rule set, where perhaps in another rule set that would not have applied. And for whatever merit it has, for whatever rule set you pick, it is very important to fence to the rule set that you are under. Because as you can see here, if you do not, you can do something that might be considered very good in one and very, very bad in another. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering what I was talking about in the beginning, because we've definitely had more than 7 exchanges. And the only thing I can say here is that whenever you have a rule set that has a limited number of exchanges, one of the most important factors is how and why exchanges are either thrown out, continued on, or reset. Now, there are obviously more than a few exchanges so far that have been reset. And normally I don't like to talk about judging or any kind of points being gotten, because when you're sitting in this chair and you're looking at the footage in slow-mo, you often see things that it's just completely unreasonable to expect other people to see during the day. So I don't want to come in and be a kind of arbiter for points. But what I am going to point out here is that we're coming up on our 8th or even 9th exchange. And what that means is that in a lot of ways, the 7 exchange limit has made it so that the mistakes that each of these fencers have made throughout this entire fight have been so much more critical than would normally be. Another thing you're going to notice is that if you look at the scoreboard back behind the fencers, is that it's very, very close in terms of points. And while, again, I don't want to talk about points, this exchange is a pretty clear one. Fencer on the right comes forward very explosively and manages to get a thrust over the top of Fencer on the left's hanging parry, and that's all that happens. But what's critical here is that this is not the last exchange, because despite the fact that this is an afterblow rule set, they only get 1 point. Now, in my opinion, and from what I can see in the slow-mo, this lands in the chest, which theoretically in an afterblow style rule set would be worth 2 points. But it seems like the judges called it a shot to the arm, which means it only gets 1 point, which means in this last exchange, which is going to happen after this, it is tied up and it is sudden death. Now, what's critical to understand here is that when you're fencing under a rule set like this, you have to make sure that you always get your afterblow points. It is of absolute critical importance that no one ever get 2 clean points on you. And the reason for this is simple, because when you have an afterblow rule set, the reason you are getting 2 clean points when you do a 2-point clean hit is because the expectation is that it's very, very difficult to land a shot to a deep target and then parry an afterblow. If you don't throw an afterblow after you get hit in a deep target, the only thing you're doing is throwing your own points and your own ability to win in the trash. So if I would have any advice here for the fencers is that, 1, very good job on that thrust, fencer on the right, but fencer on the left, you need to make sure that even though you got hit clean, you throw something. Just a little cut to the arms or the legs or the body to make sure that you are getting your points when, or at least canceling out your opponent's points when such a critical mistake does happen. And in this particular case, it can easily be the difference between winning and losing. Though in this particular case, because it was called a shot to the arm, we do have one last final exchange. So we're at our final exchange, and it's sudden death, which means in this rule set, the first clean exchange wins. And it's here that I will once again reiterate the advice I gave previously. It is of absolutely critical importance that you not allow a clean shot through, because in an unclean exchange, here defined by 2 people hitting each other in any target, you can no longer rely on a 1-point differential to win. And in this particular case, the mistake is not made by fencer on the left, but by fencer on the right. Similar to the previous exchange, fencer on the left comes forward explosively with a thrust that seems to land, as far as I can tell, very, very close to the shoulder line. But because of the instance of sudden death, all that really matters is that after this thrust lands or doesn't land, fencer on the right immediately try to throw an afterblow. And in this case, they do seem to do that. Now, we can watch the footage as much as we want, but what matters is that the judges called that the thrust to the arm did in fact land from fencer on the left. And what is interesting here is that the reason, in my opinion, that fencer on the right was unable to land their afterblow is because they tried to go for the head rather than pulling off and going for something far easier to hit. Watching the exchange, you see the thrust land, or again, maybe not land, but then immediately after it skips off, the fencer on the left goes into their classic right hanging parry. And what that does is give them a lot of good protection from the middle level horizontal strike that fencer on the right tries to throw as an afterblow. If they had instead simply pulled their sword up and come down on the top of the hands, they would have likely gotten their afterblow. If they had come underneath and tried to throw a really low left zwerg, they likely would have gotten underneath of that hanging parry and hit into the hands or the body. There were a number of ways that that afterblow could have completely saved the life, at least the fight, of fencer on the right. But instead, what happens is they throw their middle cut high, they get trapped up and maybe make a little bit of contact, but it seems like mostly get diffused by the hanging parry there, at which point it's already too late to bail themselves out. So we see the exact same mistake more or less made from both fencers, but with very, very different consequences. Whereas fencing in the previous exchange, the fencer on the right only needed to move their thrust maybe a couple inches to the left in order to hit the torso and get 2 points, whereas fencer on the left did a very good job of landing wherever it was they needed to land and then covering themselves after. And this is in a lot of ways the kind of fencing that afterblow formats look to produce. They look to produce interactions where both people are reasonably expected to be able to hit each other whenever they more or less feel like it, but where the truly great exchanges come from are ones in which they land a hit and then are able to cover themselves after. And it's the expectation of an afterblow rule set that this is significantly more difficult than doing something like in right of way, simply having attack priority. So each rule set has its give and take, but in this particular instance, we can see both the pros and the cons of a afterblow rule set in action, and we can also see some really great adaptations from 2 really high-level fencers. But if you hate afterblow rule sets and you want to yell at me, feel free to write a paragraph down in my comments, and I'll see you Thursday.